Bună ziua, dobry dzień, good morning. Well, it is a real pleasure for me to be here in this beautiful university today, sitting between two distinguished speakers, historians, Professor Gross, Petru Negura. It is an honor for me to be here on behalf of the Never Again Association that has been mentioned. It was founded in Poland in 1996, and since that time our goal, our activity is focused around breaking the silence around the issues of anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, both historically and in our contemporary society or contemporary societies in Poland and in other countries, especially in the region of Central and Eastern Europe. We have been publishing this magazine, Never Again. That is one of the recent issues, and we are lucky to publish views, opinions of distinguished authors such as Jan Tomasz Gross. And we believe it is very important to have this discussion in a mature democratic society, in a frank and open way. A frank and open discussion of the most difficult issues is a degree of maturity of democratic nations. And I think in some ways we are very proud that this discussion has started in Poland, thanks to Jan Tomasz Gross in large measure. And I have to tell you, I don't think there is any other author in modern Polish history, in fact, who has made a similar impact in society in terms of the scope, the scale of the discussion that his books have provoked in a positive sense. And I am quite certain that his books belong to the books that don't just tell history, but they also change history. And in this sense, the books by Jan Tomasz Gross, they belong on the same shelf, they are in the same class as books of Solzhenitsyn, Orwell, and similar such authors. So without any further ado, I want to give the floor to our main guest today, Jan.
Thank you very much for these very generous introductions. I'm afraid that you're going to be disappointed now, because if somebody is presumed to follow in the line of Orwell and Solzhenitsyn, you're not going to get it, unfortunately. I would like to thank you very much for coming here today. I'm sure you have your regular schedule of various academic obligations, and this is a distraction. And I'm delighted to have such a wonderful audience in this glorious building in Chisinau to talk to. We have met yesterday, and I had an opportunity to speak about the book which just came out in Russian. And I will perhaps not address directly issues which are raised in it, but speak to you more freely and kind of informally about the intellectual journey that I have made and which brought me to write these books that Rafał just spoke about. I was, in addition to appearing here and having this other occasion to speak yesterday, I gave a few interviews, and today I spoke with a young journalist, and she mentioned to me, as we were talking, that for some reason she made some interviews with young people in Chisinau a few months ago, and it turned out that when she invoked the term Holocaust, a lot of her interlocutors did not know what she was speaking about. And so permit me to just say a few things about my own encounter with Holocaust problematic, and perhaps we'll just open the floor, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I've been always interested in the story of the Second World War when I began my academic studies. It had to do with kind of a youthful engagement in a student movement in Poland in 1960s, as a result of which I, together with a lot of my friends, we found ourselves in trouble. This was still the period when the Communist Party ruled Poland, and there were all kinds of circumstances which brought this moment along, but we were expelled from the university, and then many of us spent time in jail, some for quite a long time. In the end, I decided to leave the country. The opportunity was opened at the time for people who could claim a Jewish background to say, I want to go to Israel. Then the borders of Poland would be open. They deprived us of citizenship, and we could go. A lot of us who emigrated after 1968 did not have an intention to go to Israel. We didn't have a sense of Jewishness and identity with Israel in any way. And we also had an opportunity, it turned out, to go other places. I ended up in the United States and went to school there, to study. And when it came for me to choose my topic for a doctoral dissertation, I thought, if I may say so in autobiographical terms, but in autobiographical terms that had nothing to do with the war itself, I thought about our engagement in the student movement, in the struggle for freedom of speech, for liberty, in the context of Communist Party ruled Poland. And I thought that if I focus on the experience of Polish society during the Second World War, at the time under Nazi occupation, Poland suffered terribly, but one of the very striking and characteristic features of that experience was the emergence and robustness, if you will, of the clandestine movement, and also a kind of an underground society, if you will, conspiracy that was widespread and took in people from many, many social milieus to confront and combat and oppose Nazi rule. And I thought, well, this was an instance of a society opposing totalitarian rule. In a grand scale, this is an example of something that we have done now in the 1960s as students, when we kind of protested by what we were doing, the imposition of this authoritarian, well, one might even say totalitarian controls that the Communist Party was trying to institute over Polish society. And so I engaged in an investigation of how this opposition on a really enormous scale could be mounted against an occupier, against a regime that had no compunction in using any kind of repressive measures in order to enforce its rule. Poland had suffered terribly during the Second World War. Many other societies did as well, of course, under Nazi occupation. But Nazis had a particular bent on creating a cruel regime east of Germany. They occupied Western Europe too, much of it, most of it, but somehow they respected certain rules there. In the East, they viewed the population in the East as a population that was racially inferior to them in general, and did not have any compunction in creating the most atrocious regime of brutal enforcement and exploitation. And of course, we all knew, coming in a generation only removed from the Second World War, from Eastern Europe, what has happened to the Jews. That Nazi occupation was particularly brutal and ferociously violent vis-à-vis the Jewish population. In the conception, racial conception of human worthiness, Jews for the Nazis, who took over rule in Germany in 1933, fully elected to power, if you will, in democratic elections, and then transformed German society over a period of a few years until they launched the war in 1939. For them, Jews were the kind of were removed, if you will, slowly from the pale of obligations vis-à-vis other human beings. They are considered truly on this racial scale as outcasts. But Slavs, who were not viewed with equal disdain and contempt, were also considered racially inferior to a lesser degree. And therefore the regime of occupation was really brutal vis-à-vis everybody and totally destructive, bent eventually on annihilation and extermination as directed towards the Jewish population. In Poland, where Jews before the war made up about 10% of the population of the country, well over 3 million people, 95% of the Jewish population, over 3 million people, got killed during the war. Other Poles suffered also very brutally, and in the narrative of the Second World War, this brutalization of the Polish society was something that was deeply ingrained and very well remembered. I wrote my dissertation just working in all kinds of archival collections. It was not easy because but then at that time I could not go to Poland. I left it as a persona non grata in this emigration following student rebellion of 1968. And I ended up with a monograph on Polish society under German occupation, very much focused on the issue of underground state, without really as much as mentioning, if you will. There were altogether about 2 pages when the book was published, devoted to the fate of the Jewish population in Poland. This was not, in my mind, kind of a malicious, if you will, ignorance at all. I come from first of all, part of my family history was the fate, the Jewish fate, if you will, during the Second World War. My father is Jewish, and he had to hide all throughout the German occupation, or else when spotted, he would have been killed. And I knew what happened to the Jews. But the historiographical standard of writing history, at the time when I completed my dissertation, which was in, sorry to say so, in mid-1970s, was such that historians, in my case I was studying sociology, I was a sociologist, social scientists, historians could write and conceive of the history of a European society under occupation while leaving the fate and the story of what happened to the Jews aside. Somehow it became accepted that the story of the Jews is a separate story, and that you can write a history of French society under German occupation, Dutch society under German occupation, or Polish society under German occupation, something of which I am here guilty, if you will, without devoting much attention to the Jewish experience. This was somehow a domain reserved for specialists that were writing about the Holocaust. And nobody objected to this kind of historiographical procedure, if you will. I had some very distinguished social scientists in my dissertation committee, including a very eminent historian of Poland at the time. And nobody blinked an eye. Nobody just indicated that there is something improper in this book, that it is incomplete. Well, the history of the Holocaust and of the, if you will, historiography of the Holocaust, the writing of the history of the Second World War, and paying attention and finding a proper place for what has happened to Jews is a long story in itself. It would take several decades after the war for the first, if you will, foundation piece of Holocaust historiography to be written. The author was Rafał Hilberg, a political scientist and / historian. His departmental field boundaries don't mean very much, really, when you work with empirical material. He wrote his dissertation on the process of destruction of European Jewry, and it came out in early 1960s. And at the time when he was writing it, his dissertation advisor at Columbia University in New York would tell him, "You want to write about the subject? It's your choice, but let me warn you, you'll have difficulties finding an academic employment. This is not a kind of a legitimate, quote-unquote, issue to tell from the point of view of what academic interests are." And actually Hilberg spent his life later on as a professor at a relatively provincial university, even as his fame and recognition as an author of a fundamental work on which a prolific historiography about the Holocaust would develop in later years. Nevertheless, what's characteristic here is that only in 1960s would this begin to constitute itself as legitimate and recognized, if you will, problematics for academic research. In the meantime, one could write narratives about these European societies under German occupation while separating and keeping distinct these issues, as if the experience of Jews had nothing to do, or very little to do, with the experience of the rest, non-Jewish society within these countries that had been occupied by Germany, or within the Germany itself somehow. Well, to make a long story short, this is how I started thinking, because this was a canon of historiographical work. And as time went by, I became more and more convinced that this is a completely nonsensical way of thinking about the experience of war. That the murder of a very substantial part of the population within the societies that had been occupied had to be a phenomenon that had direct impact on the entire society that surrounded the Jews at the time. If you take Poland, Jews before the war made up about 10% of the Polish population. But in the cities, in the urban environment, because of the social history of Jewish population in Eastern Europe, in the urban environment they made up about 1/3 of the population. And so, think about it, how destruction and killing of 1/3 of urban population of a country could be a topic that did not affect the rest of the population. A topic that could be encapsulated and kept aside, as it were, for specialists in the Holocaust proper, without presenting a fundamental challenge and an extraordinarily interesting theme for understanding how the rest of Polish society fared, how it responded to this phenomenon, what the consequences of it were for the people, and so forth. Think about your own city. Half of the population of Chisinau were Jews before the war. If you don't know anything about their history, you don't know anything about yourselves, your own identity in a way, you know, who you are. And is built on the layered understanding of just historical development of the place where you were born or where you live. If you're ignorant about the story of half of the population that lived here for centuries, then really there is a problem and you need to come to terms with it. And of course, the story of the killing and disappearance suddenly from the landscape of Chisinau, just like from the landscape of Polish cities, in this case, and in the case of many Polish cities as well, half of the population is a very dramatic story that affects the experience of everybody else who lived here. It took me a long time to understand this. And I think it took a long time for the general audience, if you will, the general public in all European states. The state of historiography, the condition of historiography is a proof of it, you know. Namely that Holocaust studies were late to come, and that the understanding of Jewish experience and the place of Holocaust studies for so long afterwards, even after, when Holocaust was already recognized as a legitimate subject, it was kept in a kind of a separate enclave. To me, the realization of an interface, an intimately interrelated experience of local population that was not Jewish, and Jews who lived locally, and how their fates during the war were intertwined, came with the writing of this first book that was mentioned here by Alexei, Neighbors, which came out in Poland in the year 2000, 20 years after my first book on Polish society under German occupation was published in America. It was a very simple story, if you will, and yet one that was infinitely complex, complicated, and one that was profoundly and deeply disturbing. At the beginning of the war, you may know, there was an agreement between Hitler and Stalin. They came to terms with one another, signed a treaty of non-aggression, and then a treaty actually of friendship. And as a result of it, well, this area was affected too, because Germany consented to the surrender of Bukovina and Bessarabia to the Soviet Union in 1940. In the case of Poland, it had even more profound consequences, because in 1939, in September of 1939, Poland was divided in half by Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And one half was occupied by the Soviets, the other half was occupied by the Germans. I'm just setting the stage here to say the following. When Soviet-German war broke out in June of 1941, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the first area that it took were these various territories that had been given to the Soviet Union, or that Germany consented that the Soviet Union should take over in the years 1939-1940. Chisinau was liberated in the middle of July of 1941, when German and Romanian troops came in here. The area that I'm talking about, and the city about which, the little town, well, not so little actually, it had some 3,000 inhabitants. This is not trivial. It's called Jedwabne, and it was taken over by German troops still in June of 1941. And on the 10th of July of 1941, this is incidentally, that's something that needs to be remembered here. The summer of 1941 and the onset of German attack against the Soviet Union, something that took Stalin by surprise. He couldn't believe it. Molotov, who was his foreign minister, was begging the German ambassador, saying in Moscow, "What do you want from us? I mean, why attack us? Let's come to a deal." I mean, etc., etc. But Hitler was bent on the destruction of communism and Bolshevism, which he viewed with absolute hatred. And it is in the summer of 1941 that the Holocaust proper begins, that mass killings of Jews begin on a vast scale. Initially, the perpetrators are these special troops, Einsatztruppen of the German SS, that were following the frontline troops. They were the ones who were rounding up Jews and executing them en masse since the summer of 1941. But then it turned out that they could stir the impetus among the local population to assault the Jewish neighbors on their own. It was not very difficult, it turned out, because anti-Semitism was such a pervasive norm, if you will, in the outlook and mental landscape of populations, not only in Eastern Europe, Western Europe as well, but in this case, we're talking about what's happening on the so-called Eastern Front. It was very easy to induce local people to manifest their hatred just from prejudice and to bring local people to assault their Jewish neighbors. In Jedwabne, on July 10th of 1941, half of the population of that town, we don't know exact numbers, but a kind of a paradigmatic number that stands here from the records is 1,600 people, 1,600. This was the Jewish population of the town, had been killed by their Polish neighbors, by the other half of that little town. As you can imagine, this was not a unique episode like this. Later on, when investigation of this matter began by Polish historians and lawyers, after the publication of this book, Neighbors, it turned out that there were 24 villages in the vicinity of Jedwabne, in the court district, so to speak, where similar, none of them so huge, but episodes of mass killings of Jews by their neighbors that take place in the summer of 1941. In Kishinev, on the, I believe it was July 17th, a little bit later than Jedwabne, 10,000 Jews get killed. In part, there are armies that came in here, Romanian army, German army, and these troops are involved, but the local population is involved as well. And later on, you will have a history of extermination of Jews in Bukovina and Bessarabia, where Romanian authorities and local population are deeply implicated. So, if one thinks about the history of the Second World War and the paradigm in historiography which existed for a very long time, where extermination of the Jews is a kind of a separate subject that one can investigate separately from investigation of what happened and the experience of various societies that had been occupied by the Second World War. Here you find a very palpable and direct example what nonsensical a perspective it is. What is more intimate, and how to show that the fate of Polish and Jewish population during the war was intertwined and related, than to identify an episode in which one half, a Polish half of a little town, kills the other half, the Jewish half of the little town. There is no more intimate connection than the connection that's produced in this form of interaction. And this was a study that gave impetus to investigations in Poland of more general issue, an issue of what were the relationships between local people and the Jews under the occupation in Poland. These investigations continue as we speak. Many fantastic works have been written by Polish historians, by a group of Polish historians which dedicated their intellectual efforts to the pursuit of this subject. And the body of evidence is by now enormous. It turns out that there is a lot, a very deep and detailed record of hostilities and brutalities that took place between these two groups, and simply the history of the Holocaust is now being written in a new way. It's no longer just a story of German perpetrators and Jewish witnesses, Jewish victims. There is a whole area that's being investigated of this sort of social context, a social environment from which Jews had to be pulled out in order to be killed by the Germans. And the question then that becomes the focus of modern historiography, not only in Poland, but also in France, in Holland, other places, is what were the responses and the reactions of local societies to this policy that had been brought in and instituted by Nazi occupiers. And I will leave you with this, and just invite, if you have any questions, I will try to answer them. Generally speaking, the understanding of what happened during the Second World War and the fate of Jews during the Second World War over the last 25 years or so has evolved significantly. We now know for sure that the tragic story of Jewish extermination is a story that involves, in many ways, in many different ways, depending on the pattern of German occupation in various parts of Europe, or cooperation with Germany, as in Romania, for instance, which had not been occupied by Nazi troops, but sort of was allied with Hitler for a long part of the war. That the local circumstances mattered immensely, very much, and that the experience of extermination is something that has a profound effect on the experience of local societies as well. So I thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm here for you. By the way, я очень хорошо понимаю по-русски. Мне очень трудно говорить, но если бы вы хотели спросить ваши вопросы на русском языке, так я думаю, что я могу их ответить по-английски, к сожалению. Здесь есть моя подруга Наталья. Если я чего-то не буду понимать, она меня поможет. Да.
How about the church of Hebron? They are destroyed after that?
Forgive me, if you could speak loud.
The churches of Hebron, they are destroyed after that or not?
Well, the church is a very crucial player in this whole story. Of course, Poland is a very religious country. Its Polish population is, in their vast majority, almost exclusively Roman Catholic. And the Roman Catholic Church has a complete sway over the spiritual domain, so to speak, of the Polish people. I'm saying this because before the war, Poland was a multinational country. About 1/3 of the population were people who were not ethnically Polish and not religiously necessarily Roman Catholic. There were a lot of Jews, there were a lot of Ukrainians in Poland, a lot of Belarusians, the Greek Catholic faith was prevalent among the Ukrainians, but also the Orthodox Church as well had a sway over large segments of the population, etc., etc. But we're talking now about the Polish Catholic population, where Roman Catholic Church is the dominant faith. And let me say also this: throughout occupied Poland, even though a lot of priests ended up in German concentration camps, and Hitler was waging, he really had no compunction in attacking the church itself. Still, in every village in Poland, the church was functioning. In every village in Poland, there was a local priest. And it's a quasi-uniform experience. There are a few episodes of different attitudes. For example, when we talk about that this was primarily situated in female convents, several female convents would open the doors and hide, shelter Jewish children. And the result of it is, we don't know exactly how many, several hundred, maybe a few thousand Jewish children survived the war in this context. But fundamentally, as a rule, Catholic Church was completely silent on this issue. There were no protests of any kind. The only recorded protest that we have is of that's visible in the record there, is a conversation between the Nazi Governor General of the occupied part of Poland that was not directly incorporated into the German Reich, was called Generalgouvernement, General Government. And there was a fellow who was in charge of this administration, a kind of important Nazi. He was the brains of Nazi legal system. His name was Hans Frank, and he was one of the accused during the Nuremberg trial and was hung there. So a conversation between Hans Frank and the most important Catholic bishop at the time, who was occupying the seat of the metropolitan in Krakow. His name was Sapiecha. And during this conversation, what he said to Frank, that's the only recorded, I don't know of any other, but a mention on the part of a high hierarch in the Catholic episcopate, in which the Holocaust is being addressed. He pleaded with him not to use an organization which was called Baudienst, an organization, a construction battalions, to which young Poles were forcibly inducted, not to use them in the roundings up and of Jewish ghettos. Period. Catholic Church essentially has a page here that's terrible, frankly. And this may be part of the story why it is so difficult to confront this past, because this institution would have to account for its own inaction, to say the least, during the Second World War. Yes. Oh.
Thank you. So, talking about the tragedy, it means you are talking about a problem that human beings have while discussing about our history. So it means ignorance that you mentioned today. I'm studying anthropology, and I think in Moldova we have a big problem with ignorance. And I would like to know your opinion about this process. Yes.
I think ignorance is a curse that we impose on ourselves. Nobody can be blamed for it, frankly, but ourselves. I mean by that our teachers, our historians, our politicians, and also we individually, because if we have a deep curiosity, it's not difficult to find out things. You know, in Romania, including these parts of Romania, the record of the Holocaust had been written up immediately after the war. There was a very eminent activist of the Jewish community in Bucharest. His name was Matatias Kap. And he produced a compendium of documents. He worked to survive by fluke, but not only survived, but during the war itself, with a lot of connections. This was his father was a very prominent figure already. He was able to secure and get access to a lot of internal documents, a lot of internal reports. He was working very diligently to collect all kinds of testimonies, and he produced, I think it's 2 or 3 volumes of documentation and commentary. It's called, forgive my Romanian, Cartea Neagră, I think. Anybody from 1947 who wanted to could just go to the library and read this. So, in that sense, we are responsible for our ignorance. And I think the ignorance is something that deeply hurts a community, in a way. Because the fact that we don't know and are not concerned about it does not mean that these facts disappear. They are simply non-existent in our heads, and we cannot reflect upon them. But they will come back and haunt us. You know, they will come back and haunt us in part because Holocaust is such a universal experience. This is part of the Western civilization experience, if you will. And forever in history, people will have to come back and reflect on it. And it's not the story of Polish Jews is not situated only in Poland, you know. People outside of Poland know about it. There were a lot of Jews to begin with who emigrated from Poland and who are dispersed all over the world, who know the story and who have told it. Scholars all over the world are interested in it. And the same pertains to the story of Romanian or Moldovan Jews. This is not a story that's confined to here. This is not a story that can be put under the rug locally, because it's known, it's visible, and sooner or later, unless the community works through it itself, you'll be confronted with it. And you couldn't claim innocence on the basis of ignorance. You cannot say, my goodness, I did not know my own history. You did not know? Well, shame on you.
Господин профессор, спасибо за эту встречу, спасибо за ваше выступление, спасибо за ваши книги. У меня вопрос такой. Какая была реакция в польском обществе, когда узнали из ваших книг, что сами поляки участвовали в уничтожении евреев? Спасибо.
Спасибо большое за ваш вопрос. This is a very interesting question. I could speak about it for a very long time, but I will or stop me or else I'll cut it off. The book Neighbors was published in Poland in May of the year 2000. And immediately around that time, several journalists actually went to this little town, Jedwabne, which is situated practically in the center of Poland, and interviewed local people. And within 5 minutes of coming to Jedwabne, and while talking with people of your generation, as well as, you didn't have to look for elderly folks who lived during the war. People locally will tell them, well, of course, you know, it's our folks, we, so to speak, collectively, we killed the Jews. This is despite the fact that there was a monument in town which said, a monument to the bestiality of German occupiers who killed here 1,600 Jews on July 10th of 1941. This was a lie, and everybody knew it. Locally, of course, this was a very well-known fact. Just as the fact that people were killing Jews during the war, the local people were killing Jews, was a very well-known fact in a myriad of townships in this area where the same or similar things had happened. So it's a very interesting starting point, so to speak, to my to the issue that you have raised. Locally, there has always been knowledge of crimes committed by the local population against the Jews. I bet you that in every little township in Bessarabia, in Bukovina, you will find local knowledge about what has locally happened to Jews. People will be able to tell you, including people of generations that have not witnessed it directly, because these were situations and facts and episodes of just enormous scale, in fact. And they had to constitute subjects of conversation for years to come. And we know that they did. The book was published in May. There were a few journalistic stories that came out from visits of journalists over there. We just said it. My goodness, you know, this guy wrote a crazy book. I thought, I'm going to check it out, and it turns out that this is basically true. And there was silence. For several months there was silence. The book came out at a small publishing house. And it couldn't reach very many people directly, obviously. And only when, in the end of November, I believe, so it takes about 6 months, if you will, an interview had been published with a renowned historian, not with me, somebody else, in the main newspaper in Poland. And then also an article was written by in the same newspaper by an eminent journalist. How the reading of this book is just something extraordinarily disturbing, and asking questions. You know, how is it possible? Do we know it for sure, etc., etc. Only then, if you will, the genie got out of the box, and what followed was pretty extraordinary. I happened to be in Poland at the time. By coincidence, I was already, when I emigrated from Poland, I settled in the United States. This is where I had my academic career. But this was a so-called sabbatical year for me. I had a leave from the university to do research. I was supposed to research some other subjects. And I happened to be in Poland. So I witnessed this whole debate up close. Every possible media venue, television, newspapers, weekly publications, were full of radio, were full of articles and debate about what has happened. Views were divided, if you will, and there was a big question of, if you will, confirmation, verification. Well, so somebody wrote a book, okay. But what really happened, we would like to know from the sort of other scholars, if you will. Again, by a coincidence, it was a complicated issue, because to find out, in other words, the question that would come up in front of everybody's mind is, okay, let's look at the sources and see on what basis this book has been written. even though if you went to this town and talked with local people, they would tell you, yes, of course, this is what happened. Still, people wanted to know whether the foundations of the argument that had been made were solid. This was a time of big reorganization of state archives and files of court trials. I should say first to you that the basic documentation for the book came from depositions made at 2 post-war trials, one held in 1949, that was the main trial, the other in 52 or 53, in which a group of perpetrators, a small group of perpetrators of these crimes had been put on trial. And half of them were sentenced, half of them were let go. But nevertheless, there was a kind of a body of evidence that was left in form of testimonies, and not by Jews even. You know, Jews from Jedwabne had been killed. There is one big testimony from a Jew who was hiding. And then I was able to find a few people who survived this and who later talked to me. So there is just a snippet of documentation from Jewish sources. But the basis of the documentation came from a court trial that was held in Poland in 1949. And the question, of course, once the issue became public, was to go to these court records and see if I read them correctly. But because of the reorganization of archives, I had access to these documents when they were packing, just by a fluke, again, when they were packing archives of this institution, which was called Main Commission for Investigation of German Crimes Against the Polish Nation. This was the long name of this institution that existed for tens and tens, for several decades. And now it was kind of absorbed into a new institution, which is called, until today, Institute of National Memory. Remembrance, yes. Instytut Pamięci Narodowej. And they took custody of the archives, among other institutions, of this main commission for the investigation of German crimes. But when I was reading these archives, they were being packed into boxes in order to be shipped into this new institution. Well, this is a slow work. It takes many, many months, obviously. And by the time that the book created such a stir, nobody knew which box to look. These boxes had not yet been unpacked, you know, and it took several months, though there was a suspense. It took several months for this file to come out. Then when it came out, the discussion raged again with a new impetus. And of course, there were historians who were right away saying, well, that I misread these files, and there was a discussion in the press that was more substantive, if you will, at that time. At the same moment, the Institute of National Memory or Remembrance took upon itself the task of investigating this. Once again, this is a very powerful institution that has been created after the collapse of the communist regime, that had a broad mandate in several fields, mostly having to do with investigating crimes committed by the communist regime and finding out people who are in some way implicated, and then pronouncing on their worthiness to, if they choose to be involved in public life, etc., etc. So this was a kind of a side issue, but they had a power to indict, actually. So there was what this Institute of National Remembrance or Memory began was not only a historical investigation of Jedwabne, but there was actually a prosecutor appointed who could issue indictments if he found that some people so there was a criminal investigation, if you wish, of Jedwabne, once again. A very thorough, profound initiative, but it would take, this is something that takes years, usually. They pronounced the results only in 2003. In the meantime, in 2002, they published 2 volumes of documentation about Jedwabne. 1 volume were just purely records of these trials, and some other trials that took place for crimes committed in neighboring villages, and the other was a volume of commentaries by various historians and lawyers. So a very thorough inquiry. Finally, when the criminal investigation came to an end, the verdict was that the Polish population committed these crimes. Well, they were all committed, of course, in the context of German occupation and with the permission of the Germans, if you will. But there was an issue of how many people were involved and how many Jews had been killed. But fundamentally, the findings confirmed what I had written in Neighbors. But in the meantime, there was a long-lasting debate in all the media. I may say that actually there was a certain trajectory of this discussion. You know, it kind of culminated and then abated afterwards with the anniversary event in Jedwabne on the 10th of July of 2001. This was the 60th anniversary of the murder. The president of Poland was there and he spoke. By then, the old monument, which falsely ascribed it to the Germans, had been removed. This was also a big issue. I'm not going to get into it, how to do it. And a new monument was put in place. And the president actually spoke in wonderful terms. He would say, you know, we don't know yet all the details. The investigation is still going on. It will take time, but we know enough already to know that Poles, our fellow citizens, were involved in the killings of their fellow Jewish citizens, of their fellow citizens of Jewish extraction in this place. And I speak in terms of my political responsibilities as president, and I offer my apologies. This was a very interesting occasion also because the population of Jedwabne did not participate in it. For instance, people were staying in their homes behind closed doors. The local priest was a complete denier of this crime and this story, and he was hosting the most virulent anti-Semite in Poland. That was, his name was Bubel, who was very well known for his various anti-Semitic public appearances. So, you know, there was kind of a drama to this story as well. But to make, one could speak a very long time about this response. The debate was very lively, and there were all kinds of views represented, and a significant segment of the Polish population took note of it and came out of this debate with the realization that the story of Polish-Jewish relations during the war is not the way they had been portrayed in historiography up to that time. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question, and unfortunately
Igor Kaszu. Thanks, Professor Gross, for your presentation, for your books, including this one on Sovietization of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, 39-41. As you mentioned, the Nazi policy in Europe was different. In the West, it was in some way, you know, they respected, you know, great nations and so on and so on. In the East, it was basically a war of annihilation. And what is interesting is that even though the mass killing of Jews in the West was less in numbers, for instance in France, it also took a lot of time to recognize, as the Czech president you mentioned did in a few years ago. So it takes in France, for instance, a book actually by an American historian, Robert Paxton, on Vichy regime, and it took 20 years almost when in 1996 François Mitterrand, Jacques Chirac recognized publicly the responsibility of France in that, because before that they said Vichy was not France. Very kind of. So my question is related to the fact that even today, we have a divided memory toward the traumatic past of the 20th century. In the West, basically, if you look at the textbooks and public memory, you have Holocaust very presented as in the central, and you have a kind of disbalance in the Eastern Europe, including countries that are members of the European Union. They are more concerned with the communist past. So, my question is, according to your observation, which country we need models? Not to imitate, but to be inspired of. Yes. So Poland, according to you, it's not a model. I, as far as I understand, I was recently in Poland. I have a lot of friends there. So my question is, which country do you think in Eastern Europe dealt successfully, with both memories of the Nazism and communism, and which could be a model for us? We are not the model, you know very well, and Romania is not either, or Poland, or Ukraine with Bandera. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't have, unfortunately, a good answer to this question, though this is a good question. My answer to it, first of all, would be that these two totalitarian experiences should not be in the minds of the people who went through them, lined up as in any way competing for attention, so to speak. They are, each of them is a series of horrendous tragedies of various segments of the population in its own right, and each of them should be fully documented, explored, and written about, and taught about in schools. But as to where in Eastern Europe, or I should say in East Central Europe, the experience of war has been dealt with and worked through, my answer is, even for me, a little bit disturbing. I say even for me because recently I retired from my university and my job in the United States, and moved, and I live now in Berlin. The country that dealt with it is Germany. If you go to Germany, I'm sorry?
Forget to say except Germany.
You forgot to say except Germany. And in Germany they may even object to being, but actually they are. This is Central Europe, of course, maybe not so much Eastern Europe. And well, they didn't have a choice, of course, because their responsibility is supreme in this whole thing. But it's amazing. I walk around Berlin. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to visit as well. And smack in the middle of the town, you come upon one site after another in which the atrocities of the Nazi rule in Germany, German atrocities, are commemorated in a very informative way, in spectacular way. The monument in front of the Reichstag is one of the most dramatic and successful, it seems to me, anywhere. And the results are showing. If you look at the way in which European countries responded to the current crisis of refugees from the Middle East, people who are fleeing for their lives in circumstances totally atrocious. If you think about it, they are boarding these sinking boats with their children. By thousands they die in traversing the seas of Mediterranean in order to get to a safe place. And one after another, in Eastern Europe in particular, my country, Poland, say, we're not going to take any. This is not our business. A country from which, for centuries, people were going into exile, seeking refuge either for economic reasons or for political reasons. Suddenly, we're not interested. This is shameful. Germany has learned its lesson, and it really opened its gates and offers an example of how to respond to human tragedy. I think this is fundamentally the consequence of having worked through the experience and responsibility for atrocities committed during the Second World War. Thank you very much.